partial remains of a woolly mammoth found in Michigan may provide new evidence about ancient humans. The remains were discovered in a farm field. A paleontologist from the University of Michigan says it may tell us a lot about human activity more than 11,000 years ago.
It started out as any ordinary day, a cool Friday morning in Michigan. James Bristle, a farmer, decided it was finally time to dig into one of his soybean plots. Nothing unusual about that, right? Just another routine morning job. But here's the thing. What seemed like a simple chore would soon turn into one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the state's history. James wasn't alone. Two of his friends came by to lend a hand. By around 7:30 a.m., they were already out in the dirt, joking, working, imagining how good it would feel once the labor was done. None of them suspected they were about to stumble into something that had been buried for thousands of years. The unexpected hit. About 20 minutes into the job, James's shovel struck something with a dull, stubborn thud. It wasn't the usual resistance of packed soil or tangled roots. It wasn't the brittle snap of a hidden stone. This was different. It felt heavier, deeper, as if the earth itself was hiding something that didn't belong. He stopped, staring at the patch of ground that had suddenly resisted him. At first, the explanation seemed simple enough. Probably an old fence post, buried years ago and forgotten. Fields often kept secrets like that, but as he leaned down and tapped at it again, the sound was off. Not hollow, not splintering, but rather something denser. Curiosity got the better of him. James called out to his two friends.
They hit something hard and pulled up what looked like a fence post.
I asked Jim, "Did you bury any fence here?" And he said, "No."
What was your first thought when you hit something?
I just wanted to get the tiling done.
What did we get ourselves into?
Together, they began pulling back the mud, each scrape of the shovel revealing a little more. The shape didn't look like wood. It wasn't straight, wasn't squared off. It curved and looked broad, thick and heavy with age. James brushed away a clump of dirt with his hand and froze. The color wasn't the gray of rock or the dark brown of rotting wood. It was pale, with that unmistakable texture of bone. A rib. Not the rib of a deer, not the rib of a cow, but something far beyond the scale of any animal James had ever known. A rib that stretched across the soil like a piece of architecture rather than anatomy. For a moment, silence fell over the field. Imagine standing on land you've plowed, seeded, and harvested for years, only to realize that beneath every tractor tire and boot print, the earth had been guarding the remains of a creature so large it dwarfed anything you'd ever seen. That was James in that instant, staring down at a rib that didn't just belong to another time, it belonged to another world. The weight of the discovery hung in the air. How could something like this have gone unnoticed all these years? The silence broke when one of James's friends, trying to lighten the mood, cracked a joke. He scooped up the rib, dashed through the field, and yelled about dinosaurs. For a brief second, laughter echoed. The tension lifted, and for that moment, it was easy to pretend this was just a strange, oversized relic of play. But deep down, all three men knew better. This wasn't a prank or a trick of the soil.
With harvest looming,
Our fear was down the road they found a mastodon about 20 years ago, and they were like 6 months digging that one up.
by the next day, an entire team was assembled and ready to excavate the prehistoric mammoth from its 15,000-year slumber.
This was something real, something monumental, and that realization settled like a chill. James's 5-year-old grandson, drawn by the shouts and laughter, came running down to the field. He skidded to a stop when his eyes landed on the pelvis that had begun to emerge from the soil. His small frame went still, and his mouth dropped open. No words came out, just pure, wide-eyed wonder. Children have a way of sensing when something is out of the ordinary, and this is beyond ordinary. The boy didn't need anyone to explain. The sheer size of the bone told the story. It was ancient, powerful, unlike anything a farm or even a museum trip had ever prepared him for. For James, watching his grandson freeze in awe only deepened the mystery. If it wasn't a dinosaur, then what was it? Calling in the experts. James and his friends stood there in the field, clutching the enormous bone, and they knew this was no job for a handful of farmers with shovels. Whatever they had uncovered went far beyond curiosity. It was history, hiding in their soil, and if they were going to understand it, they needed people who could read the language of bones. So, they made the call to the University of Michigan's paleontology department. Not long after, a team of specialists arrived. Among them was Dan Fisher, a professor of paleontology and the head of the university's Museum of Paleontology. If anyone could solve this puzzle, it was him. The men led the team to the site, where the rib bone lay stretched across the earth like a relic from another age. The scientists gathered around, bent low, eyes scanning every curve, every line. And then, silence. It was the heavy quiet of professionals staring at something that defied easy explanation. James and his friends shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. You expect experts to talk, to explain, to fill the silence with certainty. But here they were, locked in stillness. And sometimes, silence is louder than words. Finally, Fisher broke it. He told them he had an idea of what they were looking at, but he also believed there could be much more lying hidden beneath the soil. And to find out, they'd need to dig. James agreed, though a nervous thought lingered in his mind. What if this was all some mistake? What if they tore up his field for nothing? But something deeper told him this was worth the risk. The ground had revealed a secret once. It might do so again. Once James gave his permission, the quiet farmland transformed almost instantly. The scientists wasted no time. They had just a single day to see what secrets the soil might yield, and the sense of urgency was palpable. 15 staff members from the University of Michigan arrived with tools, equipment, and practiced precision, stepping onto the field not as casual visitors but as detectives entering a crime scene frozen in time. The soybean rows became something else entirely, a dig site alive with purpose. Boots sank into the wet ground, hands worked shovels and brushes, and the mud that had clung so stubbornly to the bones became the very canvas of history. The ordinary field James had plowed so many times was now an archaeological stage. They weren't alone. Heavy machinery joined the effort, led by excavator operator James Ballinger. His machine roared to life, metal teeth sinking into earth that had held its silence for over 10 millennia. The atmosphere buzzed with energy. Every movement was charged with anticipation. Every new patch of earth peeled back with the hope of finding more. The workers shouted to one another across the mud, voices rising above the hum of machinery. The entire crew was driven by the knowledge that the clock was ticking. They had only hours, not weeks, and every second wasted meant a fragment of history might stay buried. Speculation rippled through the team as they dug deeper. Was this creature whole, resting intact beneath the soil? Or were these just scattered remnants of something larger, long lost to time? Had the animal died naturally on this land, collapsing under its own weight in its final moments? Or had it been dragged here by ancient hunters seeking to harvest its strength? Theories swirled like the dust and mud rising from the excavation. Some imagined the mammoth crashing through the ice in its last struggle. Others wondered if hunters had surrounded it, spears piercing its hide. Every theory painted the soil with ghosts of possibilities, none of them certain. And then, just as curiosity had reached its peak and the tension of not knowing began to press on the crew, it happened. A shout cut through the noise. Tools stopped. Heads turned. Every worker dropped what they were doing and rushed to the spot where one of the team had frozen in place. Something was jutting out of the soil, something larger, stranger, more definitive than anything they had uncovered so far. It was the moment that would shift the dig from speculation to revelation. For hours, the field had been alive with the rhythm of digging, shovels sinking, machines churning, voices calling across the mud. Everyone was tired, but curiosity kept them going. And then, suddenly, a sharp cry rang out. One of the workers froze, pointing at something jutting out of the dark soil. The others rushed over, boots thudding, hearts racing. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a pale curve breaking through the earth. But as they scraped and brushed away the mud, the curve stretched and stretched. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't debris. It was a tusk. It was long, arched, and gleaming faintly beneath the dirt. The kind of sight you expect to see behind glass in a museum, not rising from the ground of an ordinary Michigan farm. The kind of image is usually confined to textbooks, sketches, or prehistoric illustrations. The effect was immediate. The entire crew, already buzzing with speculation, shifted from doubt to certainty. This wasn't just some oversized rib from an unknown animal. This wasn't cattle or horse or anything remotely familiar. This was something monumental. Dan Fisher stepped forward, his face reflecting the weight of recognition. With calm authority, he confirmed what everyone else was now daring to believe. The bones, the rib, the sheer size of the tusk, it all pointed to one conclusion. They were standing over the remains of a mammoth. And not just a relic from the distant past, but one that had roamed the very earth they were standing on between 10 and 15,000 years ago. A creature that had lived and breathed while glaciers still scarred the land, while early humans fought for survival against giants. The field, once just another stretch of farmland, had transformed into a window into prehistory. And with that tusk rising from the soil, there was no turning back. Clues in the bones. The deeper the team went, the more the earth began to give up its secrets. Every rib, every fragment pulled from the mud carried not just weight, but whispers from another age. And then came something that made the experts pause. A mark. It wasn't random. It wasn't the kind of jagged damage that happens when bones are buried for thousands of years. This was deliberate. A clean, purposeful cut along one of the ribs. The kind of incision that suggested a sharp tool guided by human hands. The field went quiet for a moment as the realization sank in. This wasn't just an animal that had died naturally. It might have been hunted, taken down by people who had once walked this very land, carrying spears and blades, driven by survival. But the evidence raised more questions than answers. If hunters had indeed killed this massive creature, why hadn't they feasted on it? Why bury a prize like this in the ground instead of consuming the meat or putting every last piece to use? In an age when survival meant using every scrap of an animal, from the hide to the bone, why would such abundance go untouched? Dan Fisher stepped in with a theory. What if this wasn't a waste at all? What if it was strategy? He suggested that ancient hunters may have dragged the carcass into a pond, letting the cool water preserve it. An early form of refrigeration, long before iceboxes or storage pits, using nature itself as a tool to keep the meat from spoiling. It was a simple but ingenious idea, burying abundance in the earth not as a loss, but as a way of saving it for later. And yet, standing there, staring at the cut marks, one couldn't help but wonder, did those hunters ever return for their prize? Or had time swallowed the secret whole, leaving the mammoth to rest in silence for 15,000 years until James Bristle's shovel struck its bones? As the long day wore on, the muddy soybean field began to resemble something out of an ancient excavation site. Piece by piece, the fragments of a lost world emerged from the soil, each one more staggering than the last. First came the pelvis, broad, massive, a foundation stone of the creature's frame. Then the skull, heavy and unmistakable, its twin tusks still intact and curving outward like ivory crescents. It wasn't just a bone, it was a face, a profile of an animal that had walked the earth thousands of years before humans ever dreamed of plowing these fields. The ribs followed, wide as archways, fanning out in a way that hinted at the colossal chest they had once supported. Then came the shoulder blades, once anchoring the muscles of a beast strong enough to tear through snow and ice. Sections of the spine lay beside them, each vertebra like a building block of nature's most formidable architecture. The picture was incomplete. The hind legs and feet were missing, scattered or lost to time. But even so, the skeleton told its story. It lay there in remarkable condition, preserved against all odds. The mud had protected it, shielding the bones from weather, scavengers, and decay for millennia. When Dan Fisher looked over the collection spread across James Bristle's field, he didn't hesitate. He called it one of the top 10 most important discoveries ever made in Michigan. Think about the scale of that statement. Out of decades of study and thousands of specimens cataloged, this was not just another mammoth bone tossed into storage. This was a defining moment. A find that didn't just add to the record, it reshaped it. And it had all begun with the strike of a farmer's shovel on an ordinary Friday morning. Not quite woolly. At first glance, the creature seemed familiar. The massive tusks, the towering frame, the sheer size, it all screamed woolly mammoth, the legendary Ice Age giant most people picture when they imagine prehistory. But as Dan Fisher examined the bones more closely, subtle differences began to surface. The details didn't quite match the story everyone thought they knew. Here was the twist. Despite its resemblance to the shaggy titans of frozen tundras, this animal might not have been fully woolly at all. Dan pointed out features in the skull and tusks that hinted at something rarer, something more complex. His conclusion? The remains could belong to a Jeffersonian mammoth, a hybrid species, part woolly, part Columbian. Think about that for a moment. A creature that wasn't just one thing, but a blend, a living intersection between two ancient lineages. The woolly mammoth, draped in dense fur, adapted to survive the bitter cold. The Columbian mammoth, larger and built for slightly warmer climates. And here, in James Bristle's field, lay evidence of a crossover. A genetic experiment written not in a lab, but in the pages of evolution itself. To scientists, this made the discovery even more valuable. It wasn't only about recovering bones, it was about unlocking a story of adaptation, migration, and survival. These hybrids carried traits of both parents, bridging environments and hinting at how mammoth populations may have shifted and changed with the ice, the land, and the people who hunted them. In that muddy Michigan field, what had first seemed like a straightforward find had suddenly become something extraordinary, a creature that blurred the lines of classification, a fossilized reminder that nature is rarely simple, and history is always layered with surprises. News of the discovery spread like wildfire across the Michigan countryside. At first it was just neighbors wandering over, drawn by whispers of bones the size of tree trunks unearthed in a soybean field. But soon, the quiet farm was no longer just a farm. It became a gathering place. Teachers began to arrive, leading groups of students who stared wide-eyed at the excavation site. Parents brought their children, eager to give them a memory they would never forget. Others holding the hands of the youngest visitors, all sharing the same sense of wonder. The field that once echoed only with the hum of farm equipment now buzzed with the voices of families standing together before history itself. The farm had transformed into a kind of open-air museum, though its treasures were not behind glass, but lying raw in the mud where they had rested for millennia. Among the visitors was a man in hospice care, frail and nearing the end of his life. Even so, he made the journey to the farm to see the bones for himself. His presence underscored the power of discovery, the way it calls to people regardless of age or circumstance, compelling them to witness something larger than themselves. For James, the sudden shift was overwhelming. His land, usually defined by the quiet rhythms of planting and harvest, had become a hub of curiosity and awe. The steady, predictable life of the farm gave way to a scene alive with anticipation. Each visitor stood before the bones with the same expression: amazement, disbelief, and reverence for the enormity of what had been pulled from the earth. The farm was no longer just soil and crops. It had become a bridge between worlds, the present and the ancient past, where ordinary people could stand only feet away from the remains of a creature that had walked the land 10,000 years ago. The final decision. When the digging was finished and the bones lay stretched across the field, a new question emerged. What do you do when you unearth the remains of a creature that lived tens of thousands of years ago? Does it become a personal keepsake? Something to show off to visitors? Does it turn into a display piece for the curious? A spectacle for the public to marvel at? Or does it become a commodity, sold to the highest bidder as a rare trophy of prehistory? The weight of that choice fell on James. The land was his, the discovery was his, and in that moment, he held responsibility not just for himself, but for the story of the animal whose bones had resurfaced. For James, the answer did not come from thoughts of profit or prestige. It came from a sense of duty. He knew the discovery had to mean more than curiosity or ownership. This mammoth had survived in silence for thousands of years beneath his field, hidden in the soil while generations of people passed overhead with no idea what lay below. Now that it had been revealed, it deserved more than to be locked away or reduced to an ornament. He made his decision. The remains would go to the University of Michigan. There, scientists could study them, unravel their mysteries, and perhaps reconstruct a clearer picture of the past. By giving the mammoth to research, James ensured that the discovery would live on, not just as bones in a field, but as knowledge shared, lessons learned, and history brought closer to understanding. It wasn't about personal gain. It wasn't about recognition. It was about letting the creature's story continue, long after its life had ended and long after its bones had been hidden by time. James's field had revealed a secret. His decision guaranteed that secret would not vanish back into obscurity. Instead, it would become part of something far larger, a collective effort to piece together how life once roamed across Michigan, long before tractors tilled the soil or fences divided the land. The farm had given up its ancient guardian, and in doing so, it had connected the present to a world that had seemed lost forever. The real terror isn't in the bones themselves, it's in the reminder. For centuries, these creatures ruled the land. They were massive, powerful, and, at times, preyed upon by humans who fought simply to survive. Beneath the quiet soil of Michigan, under soybean fields and tractor tracks, the earth still keeps secrets of an ancient world, a world where mammoths walked, hunted, and were hunted in return, and all it took was one farmer, one shovel, and one ordinary Friday morning to bring that world back to the surface.